Good morning. Thank you all for coming. I know there's some fabulous sessions, so I appreciate you taking the time to come here. I see some familiar faces. This is where I tell my standard New Jersey jokes, so there are two of them. Wait for it. Number one, I was born in New Jersey, so this is coming home. Mount Holly, there's I hope, still a hospital there. That was me. I moved when I was 4, so I'm not exactly a hometown kid. But my father has grand memories of being a student at Rutgers University. He tells me it was some of the best 2 weeks of his life. So he then quit and he moved to Oklahoma to sell tombstones. And just, that starts a story. You just got to go there. Anyway, thank you so much for coming. What I'd like to talk about are sort of less better. I realized that as I started a new job in the fall, and when you start a new job, of course, you're out to impress and figure out and show everyone, and I was like suddenly realizing I was digging myself deeper and deeper with these things, and I really committed myself that I needed to do fewer things, but I needed to do those things better. And the semicolon is very important because obviously you don't want to just say, I'm going to do better by doing fewer things. You want the things themselves to get better. And it's sort of a contrast to another book I wrote called Expect More. So an idea I'm working out. So what I thought I would talk about is sort of in two parts. I think I want to talk a little bit about communities and knowing the communities, saving the communities, really being existent and very much following up on our excellent keynote speakers. And then in part two, I really want to spend a little bit of time on what I think we need to do as professionals and library staff to be ready to do that. Because as we have seen through this pandemic over and over again, it's not enough to say, yes, we're going to save the world, when oftentimes it is we need a lot of saving ourselves and talking about how we prepare for that environment. So, part one, saving our communities. So, a lot of what we're talking about these days is community engagement, being centered on the community, community-driven, lots of different phrases. And in some ways, it's an extension of what we used to call public service, many still do, but that idea that public service, when we talked about reference, we talked about interlibrary loan, we talked about different programs we put on, was very much about focused on us as the library and what we could do. It was very much a product of a library that is in a deficit mode. That is, we were here to fix things. Why do we have libraries? Because people can't read. Why do we have libraries? Because people are lonely. Why do we have libraries? And it was this constant list of things that our community was not doing well. And as we really work on, and Marie Radford's in the audience, and so I have to give a shout out to early reference work, but her work on, for example, reference encountering, which is you really need to build a relationship. It's not simply a transaction, right? Here's a question, here's an answer. Here's a person, here's a book. It really is an evolving social relationship, and we've seen that blossom and expand to how we look at our libraries about building a relationship with our communities. And that is not simply a matter of serving them, it is talking and being part of them and understanding and being in the area of their aspirations. How do we understand what our communities want to be, where to go, us as part of it, and then how do we help them achieve it? I always say this is very much like friends. You don't have a lot of great friends who tell you what's wrong with you all the time. So it's because clearly I could have a lot of conversations with friends going suspenders and a bow tie. This is not a Christmas Hallmark movie with a Southern lawyer in it, but that's where we're headed. Right? So we want to talk about things that lift us up and move us forward. So when community-centeredness is done well, it does amazing things. And I want to give, libraries should seek to meet the aspirations and the character of the community, and I want to do that by telling you about a library. So I'm in Texas now, so you're welcome. One of us had to take that shot. And so what I did is I've spent a lot of time going out about and meeting Texans and finding cowboy boots and saying y'all a lot and things of that nature. And it's been an amazing situation. So I was in New York for 20-some years in Syracuse area, and then I was in South Carolina for 6 years, pit stop. Now I'm in Austin for a year. And they're all very different characters of their libraries. And academic libraries, we're talking about major universities, different academic libraries, but in their, talking about school libraries, very different. I was amazed, and I thought New York had really strong school librarian requirements, and then I moved to South Carolina where every school, K to 12, is required to have a school librarian by law. and talking about how they put them together. And then to move to Texas, which is, well, if you want one, you can have one, and if you want one, they've got to be certified, but you don't have to have one. This is not a great situation, right? So learning about that, and then I spent a lot of time learning about public libraries. Spent some time in the state library, getting out, and in that process, I came across the Pottsboro Public Library. Now let me draw you a picture. Texas is frickin' big, and there's big in these major cities, followed by a lot of gorgeous prairie land, and then these itty-bitty towns. Pottsboro is on the Oklahoma-Texas border. There's a lake there, which makes it an excellent little retirement community, but it is a speck. The service population of the Pottsboro Public Library is 1,500 people. If you include the surrounding county, it gets up to a massive 2,500 people. Right? So it's not big. And I'll tell you, as every state has rural libraries, some are amazing, some are not so amazing. We have some not so amazing ones as well. Like, for example, once again, a public library, to be a certified public library, you have to, wait for it, take in public funding. If you're above a certain size, you have to have a certified librarian, but that's like at the 50,000 and up. So once again, a lot of rural libraries with 1,500 people, not a lot of librarians that come through traditional training, through practice, and I've always said there are three ways to be a librarian: by education, by being hired as one, a job title, or by spirit. We all know librarians that they organize things in their nightstand, their book reading collection. So we have a situation that there are a lot of rural libraries with not a lot of people with library. One librarian was hired, and the first purchase she made was to get the chain for the reading glasses because she thought that's what librarians needed. All right? So I ran into Pottsboro Library, and it's like, what's going on at Pottsboro? This is a former post office. It is not as big as this room that we're in, and it is the library. And so, you're walking in going, It is run by Diane Connery is their director. And Diane Connery, when she moved there, basically for the lake, attended its city council meeting. The town said, we're going to close the library. And she said, no, well, I think we should keep going. And they're like, would you like to do it? And she said, sure, without any experience in libraries. And she started to do it. And to this day, she receives a $0 salary to run the library. I asked her about this, and she said, I can leave any damn well I please. If they want to bring this banned book shit up here, I'm out of here. Eventually, the city and council now provided $35,000 annual income, and she pays a full-time library person and as a volunteer at the desk. So once again, not expecting a huge amount. But what I'll show you are those pictures, and I'll start with the one right next to in the top here. That is their telemedicine center. By the way, she's since gotten her Master's of Library Science, she said out of spite, from Texas Women's University, so she's in the fold now. But she started a telemedicine center. We all think about telemedicine, and we might think that, it's just a bandwidth issue, particularly in rural areas, but it's also a privacy issue. When you are at home during COVID and you need to talk with your doctor and your kids are next to you and your husband or spouse or whatever's next to you, this is not necessarily the environment you want to have these confidential conversations. So they took an old closet, cleared it out, put a high bandwidth connections with lighting, an external door for complete privacy, and people can schedule it, and they have a relationship with the local hospital so that they provide telehealth services. And you're going, okay, wouldn't have expected that. The one below it is a little more interesting. It is the Pottsboro esports team. They have an esports team where they have teens and tweens. They've partnered with a local university, and they have tournaments and competitions and a competing esports group. They have a virtual reality lab. They have a makerspace. They have robotics. They have areas, this lovely picture of their digital navigators. They have hired full-time 2 people who will come in every day to work with primarily seniors, but anyone who shows up with a computer or a phone and goes, I have no idea what I'm doing, and they walk them through that. In the back of this building, they have a shed that they've attached with their library of things that apparently people use to set the stage for weddings, and they have a 20-foot steel tower and a generator sitting in their back garage. In fact, this is the back of their building, and you can't see it, but what those cars are parked at, they're looking at this lovely trailer. They're having a COVID gaming tournament. You can't do it because now they have a 20-foot high powered antenna that is providing white space wireless network to everyone within a 2-mile radius. You can walk into the library, you can check out a wireless router, take it home, and you have internet connectivity. There is nothing that this frickin' library doesn't do. So this zero paid librarian with 1 library staff and 1 seating is frankly one of the most innovative libraries I have seen in the world, period, enough said. Anytime that we talk about great, cool things that libraries can do, librarians, we're great people, but we love every idea. There's no bad ideas in librarianship. Only bad ideas from my library, right? It's like, oh, that's great. I'm glad that Pottsboro would do it. We couldn't do it because we're too big, or we're too small, or we're too left, or we're too green, or we're too whatever, right? This is a no excuse area. She has it and she does it. By the way, in terms of how that happens, it's a relationship with their state library. There's a huge amount of grants. So while she doesn't take $1 from the city, she takes a salary, a reasonable salary from all the grants and incomes that she writes, and she writes them on a regular basis. She has testified before Congress on rural broadband. She's just an amazing librarian, and they're doing amazing things. And it moved from the situation where they were talking about closing down the library to now judges and people within the county come to the library to do different services, from vaccinations to all these different things, because that's the place that is connected to the community and has demonstrated service. And that's one of the things that I talk about with students, because one of the questions we'll get to a little bit later is, so why is that a library? Why is the library doing esports? And why is the library doing this? And why is the library doing that? And the answer is not, well, this is the answer that makes everyone feel comfortable. The answer is, well, I've been doing this for 8 years and we've been doing good stuff, so trust me. This is what a library is because this is what we've talked about and agreed to what a library is. So there are all these amazing examples. I'll give you a few other ones because I am clearly someone who enjoys food. And if anyone hasn't noticed, in fact, I think today via Noah Lenstra tweeted out an example where someone just studied food programs in public libraries. And they're really cool programs. So I want to just quickly touch on 3 of them. The first one in Toronto. So in the Toronto Public Library, in Toronto, COVID hits, everything shuts down. One of the most vulnerable sectors of society we know are seniors. It turns out that the food pantry system in Toronto is run primarily with seniors who are volunteers, and suddenly they couldn't run. They didn't have staffing, they didn't have support. So Vickery Bowles, who's the director, reached out to her staff and asked for volunteers, also become important later in the conversation, and said, who wants to help? And they set up food pantries in branches all over the city of Toronto. If they didn't have enough room in the buildings, they dropped in winterized, it is Toronto, winterized shipping containers. And it was like a great idea. And the librarians came in and people would come to get food, and people were in the community, they were reconnecting. And then they found out that people who run food pantries don't know anything about logistics and distributions. What's happening is the truck would go to the grocery store, they'd say, you got any extra stuff? They'd throw stuff on and they'd stop at the first food pantry and drop it off. And by the time they were at the last food pantry, it was basically like 3 Twizzlers and yet another thing of cream of mushroom soup. So what Toronto said is, great, we're fixing this. We do distribution all the time. They took their book materials distribution center and turned it into a food distribution center. So all food was brought together. They then created bundles and packages so people could just come and take them. They added reading materials and such to those, and then they created this connections. They're still running 2 or 3 of these food pantries. They became the largest food pantry system in Canada, and I think probably in the US, doing this system. So why? Because their community was in need. Their community was making part of it, and you say, but they weren't, this wasn't a book distribution system. No, this was, people aren't ready, Maslow's hierarchy of needs. If you're hungry, you can't read. If you're hungry, you can't learn. If you don't feel safe in your environment, how are you going to express and experience and become a part of that community? They realized this, and they built that system. They built that to connect to their community and be part of that community. And when the community was back on its feet enough that they could provide those services, then they were able to step away and go back to other functions they were doing. The Philadelphia Free Library, right west of us, built a kitchen in their new main library where they renovated it. Their culinary research or culinary instruction center. I apologize for not knowing the name off of it. But it was the idea of food deserts. That in downtown Philadelphia, as many of our downtown spaces, there wasn't access to good, healthy food, and so many different social programs provided good, healthy food that no one not having the experience knew what to do with, right? When you're handed celery, God help you, what do you do with it? When you're handed a head of cabbage, what the hell do you do with it? And so they began teaching people how to prepare these services. And then they realized that once they were talking about it, food becomes very central to the social life of a community. And so what you're seeing now is they began inviting new Americans to come in and prepare food from their home countries and share those things. They were literally providing a place for a community to break bread together. And yes, they were providing information and knowledge about cooking and materials, and yes, you could learn about these through other services, but the bottom line, they were supporting their community's needs in learning and once again, looking at their aspirations. We want to be a community that is healthy, we want to be a community that is caring, and the library is an instrumental part of that. The last one is one of my other favorite library systems, the Charleston County Public Library System in South Carolina. And the Charleston County Public Library System is interesting. So in South Carolina, their public libraries are organized by counties. And there are 3 things that every county must have in South Carolina. Can you guess the 3? The interactive portion of our day. No. The library is one. Well, yeah. And by the way, it is mustard-based barbecue. I mean, just let's be real. That's what it should be. What other institutions must a county provide to its service? A library, a school, and a jail. So, they're county-based and they're large. So Charleston goes from that lovely, delightful southern charm of downtown Charleston out to the suburbs, which are very rural. And they have 70 plus locations and such. And so they, once again, had this situation in their more rural areas of healthy food. And so they created these free and fresh lockers. And so they're just refrigerated lockers and anyone can come in and grab food. And when I say anyone, I mean anyone. They began this discussion about, do people have to sign up? Do they have to show a card? And do they have to show need? And they said no. If there's a 12-year-old who's studying and gets hungry and wants an apple, take an apple. And the reason they determined this is because they also took on all of the rent relief programs from federal government. The state and the county turned to the library to be the place where people signed up for rent relief, and they looked at just the abusive amount of paperwork, documentation, and stuff that people had to go through, and they said, we are not doing this for feeding people. And so they got rid of it. So all of these are examples of food services in a public library, and once again, beg a question, why a library? Well, the answer is, once again, people learn in different ways, and if we're about learning, if we're about having people discover and understand themselves, even if they're learning what they love to read or indulge in or what have you, they have to be fed, they have to be healthy, they have to feel welcome and secure. And so food became part of it, but it's not just, they're not running a restaurant, and this is not the equivalent of the library cafe in the corner. This is fundamental to their education mission in what they're doing. So, it, however, begs the question, why is this a library? And can't this go too far? Right? There's the issue of a jack of all trades, master of none. What happens when a library tries to do everything? I mean, in some ways, Pottsboro Public Library is trying to do everything, but they're doing it in a way that's connected with the community and requires community ownership. The esports team is not going to continue unless someone within the community takes that ownership within it. They're not offering a bunch of superfluous programs. What I don't have on that first slide are all the things they killed. Because they would try something, they would put something in, it didn't work, and they would get rid of it. So we need to talk about the idea that when we look at offering new services, when we look at community aspirations, what do we do and what don't we do? Because if we become trying to do everything, eventually people will look at public libraries as the place where they try to do everything and nothing very well. What we've seen, particularly in the public library space, is the retreat of social services, right? It started with the tax forms and then tax guidance and all these other public services the government was offering. Suddenly those human people in the communities disappeared, and the library sort of began stepping in saying, I'll take it, I'll take it, I'll take it. And what that opens you up to eventually is a discussion of, well, geez, libraries are really crappy at tax preparation. Yeah, we really, right? And we see this, for example, in workforce development. Oh, these people don't know how to get people jobs. Well, the answer is some of us do. There are some amazing workforce development programs, everything from how to prepare your resume to loaning out clothes and materials, but it takes dedication and expertise, and I cannot emphasize this enough, strong partnerships. It's not that the library does everything, it's the library does a lot, and they know how to build strategic relationships with other people who are doing strong things. Offering high school equivalency programs, working with universities to do information literacy. One of the things we did in South Carolina is it was our seniors are your freshmen. That is working with school librarians and academic librarians teaming up so that when you talk about information literacy in the high school curriculum and they go to college, there's a natural handoff of those skills going back and forth. We need to begin thinking about adapting and not adopting things. Those food programs are great, and you may want to go back and like bring a Weber grill to the middle of your barbecue and your library and start making steaks. That'd be awesome. But the question is, how is that going to play in your community? We need to get this idea of toolkits and best practices and blow them up. I mean, honestly, in librarianship, this goes back to Melville Dewey, who was all about efficiency. I mean, he's all about other things like misogyny and anti-Semitism, but efficiency was also on that list. And the idea that we want to do it's a copy cataloging. Everyone can just copy everyone's cataloging, except of course we know that when you get certain materials, particularly if you're in frickin' Texas, they don't all necessarily end up in the same place or under the same headings and what's the community want, etc. So we need to look at not the idea of one library, everyone in Jersey, every public library, every academic library, every school library looks like this, works like this, feels like this. The answer is there is no single future or model for libraries, but there are as many as the communities we serve. When I walk into Newark, when I walk into Mount Holly, when I walk into Trenton, does your library look like your community, or does it look like every library else that's out there? When the Scandinavians, and they have some beautiful libraries, decided that sub-Saharan Africa needed libraries, they built Scandinavian libraries in sub-Saharan Africa. So they had the reference desk up front and Dewey Decimal sitting in the back and waiting for people to come in. And there wasn't anything, for example, until, for example, public libraries in Kenya began adopting and saying, we need ceremonial garb. We need people that for tribal traditions where we can preserve this material, but they're also in use so that we can make them, provide them and be part of that community. And they began building lots of public libraries in Nairobi, and as they moved further out, they eventually moved to donkey carts where they didn't have good roads, and eventually to get to really remote desert areas, they built camel libraries that would come in with camels on a regular basis, set up places to learn to read and materials and discussion, and that's what it needed to look like in that community. What does it need to look like in yours? So we need to, once again, the common linkage between libraries shouldn't be our floor plan. And it shouldn't be a master collection plan. And it shouldn't be an honest-to-God policy. It should be you. Your job is to know your community's need, have the professional skills to provide them, and to link to this amazing community you're all part of, constantly scanning the environment for what's cool, what's new, what might work, and then to adapt it that works here. So this community centrism can also be taken too far. That is, I hear a lot of discussion already for community centered, whatever the community wants, they get. The buyer is always right, whatever it is. Garbage, right? This is very much the customer centered view of libraries, which I hate a lot. I mean, I hate it when any sort of governmental institution calls me a customer because it sounds like I could go shopping, and trust me, if I were shopping for governments, I would find a better one, right? So this is the idea that the community, whatever the community wants, and I'll give you two examples. In England, during pre-pandemic days, but during the economic downturn after we destroyed the banking system in 2007 and 2008, wanted to say we don't have enough money, so their public library law said that local councils, local city governments had to have a public library. They more or less said wink, wink, nod, nod, but we can be flexible in how you define that. And what many councils did in England, and I would say the UK, but they fared better in Scotland and Wales and in Northern Ireland, is they said, just have one. They said, a lot of people come in libraries, let's just let them run them. Volunteers will run them, and it'll be fine. And don't worry if they don't buy any new materials. I'm sure the books they have on the shelves will serve us for another century. Right? This idea that libraries could be without a level of professional, without a level of dedicated staff, and the values that we bring to it is problematic. We also see this example in other areas, including in Florida, that wanted to hire the theme park designers to design a new public library because it was going to be a compelling experience. And I was like, that's lovely, but also, is it an educational and safe and culturally sensitive experience? Does it deal with the idea of how we seek and find information? Does it build relationships, or is it got a lot of neon in it, right? So we see the situation. We also see this in materials challenging. In, once again, yes, Texas, but also many other states, as we see the idea of banning books, which is nothing new, but certainly the intensity that we're experiencing now is unusual and worth the attention we give it. What we're seeing is the exclusion of the professional in these challenges. That's what's most problematic. It's not that these books are being challenged and going through a challenged process. It's challenging going through a political process that excludes the professional in doing it. We have libraries, public libraries and school libraries that are closing so that the library board can go through and examine the collection in person and eliminate the materials that they do not feel best reflect the community. Because in this definition, we are a service appended to a community, not part of it, with its own voice and its own values. That's what's problematic about the current issue of book banning distribution. We also see in schools the big issue is not that people want to ban books, because they'll tell you, I don't want to ban books. I just want them to be educationally appropriate, ... as I define it, right? And we see that the loud voice doesn't care about the voices that aren't yelling about what happens, and the professionals, once again, being taken out of that circuit. To me, that's a community-centered approach that's gone too far. There is a need for a part of the community, of which you all are, that has a voice to lend your professionalism. So instead of seeking to be all things to all people, we must strive to do less better. It's not what Pottsboro's doing or Trenton's doing or what cool thing is happening over here. It's what does our community need? Not the same as every library. You may be doing different stuff less and better than others, but that's what you need to be. What does your library look like? How does it feel? I was in Oslo. Oslo just opened a beautiful new central architectural genius library. It's gorgeous. It's amazing. But they also redid all of their branches. And if you I walked into one branch, and it was the Book Palace. I mean, it was beautiful light and trees falling on stacks and reading nooks. I mean, this was the place that if you wanted to take the stereotype of the librarian who reads all day, this is where you would work. Right? I went to another branch, and it was in a gentrifying neighborhood, and it looked like a coffee bar. There was a collection on the outside, but there were literally 2 stages on either end of the single floor, and a coffee bar where you could go and get your brewed coffee. And they said, well, the deal is these are really expensive apartments. They're also really tiny apartments. People needed a living room. This is what they needed out of the library, was a place to get together and be a place to be together and have culture and have different connections back within it. Those 2 libraries are not right or wrong. Those 2 libraries are in the same system, but they look and feel like their community. Even the new architecturally beautiful Oslo Library, the idea of a central library used to be the library of last resort. If you didn't have it or couldn't keep it in the branch or whatever, you could always enter a library loan from the central library. Well, they got rid of that. They brought over 50% of their collection from their previous building. And I said, is that for expansion? They said, no. Yes, we have less space here because we have more meeting spaces, more communal spaces. We look at this as the downtown branch. This is the branch for people in downtown, as opposed to this is the foreboding area with lots of collections. This is particularly vital as communities atomize. The communities that we are serving have never been homogeneous, even though we have treated them as such. But increasingly, they are becoming antagonistic towards each other. And I didn't use the word polarized. I like this phrase, atomized, better. Because it doesn't just mean we have Republicans and Democrats and we have conservatives and whatever. We've got lots of different sectors that are seeking to provide a voice and influence the conversation. As they should. But what we need to do is thinking about how do we begin to weave that community together? Where do we find the commonality? Where do we find this? And I was just thinking about, once again, Richland Public Library in Columbia, South Carolina, has their difficult conversations. The idea was that they were going to pick a different topic every couple of months, and the first one they got to is diversity, and they've been talking about it now for 6 years. And they have 50 people coming in. They just had a difficult conversations phone session with 200 people on a conference call having this conversation, with black elders sitting next to former white supremacists talking about how we can do this better. And they trained the librarians to be facilitators. It wasn't simply a matter of going, hey, good news, you're done cataloging, could you go handle the race conversation? They prepared them to do that. So we need to weave this community. And in many ways, we need to stop serving our communities and we need to start saving our communities. The idea that we can be passive, the idea that we are a service to a community, is got to go away. We must be part of the community, and as that we have agency and power, not simply serve them, but save them. We need to stand up to the banned books conversations. We need to stand up to the atomization. We need to look for consensus. We need to ask libraries, what are we doing about the scourge of school shootings? What are we doing about mass shootings? How do we have people in our communities that are hurting from the pandemic, from violence, from these things? How do we go and say, how do we actively engage this community to prevent this from happening again? And how are we part of that conversation? These are not the idea of returning to bibliofundamentalism. I want to be really clear. When I say do less better, and when I say talk about focus your services, that doesn't mean let's go back to being the book people. Let's go back to be that quiet sanctuary where people get their books. That might serve some of our communities, but many of us have artistic communities, have whole different kinds of communities. What do they look like? It's not about returning to book palaces. Rather, it's a means that we must throw off being unbiased. So, when we look at things like book bannings, we need to defend against this idea of censorship, against the idea of restricting important voices, not because we do all things to all people, we're unbiased and objective, but because we are not neutral and we are actively cultivating collections. There was a really trash piece of New York Times editorial, which I'm mad that they published, on woke librarians. Did anyone see that one? The problem with banned books is not banned books. People don't want to ban books. They simply want to make sure that their voices are heard as well. I'm in New Jersey, so I can use this appropriate language. Bullshit. They're not coming in going, I don't care that there are books about trans and there are people with African American heroes and stories and whatever. No, I just want to make sure that we have good old-fashioned books about the history that never occurred. That's not what's happening, right? And so the idea of saying, well, but you can't come to a public library or a school library, we are objective, we're neutral, we collect all sides of things. We never have collected all sides of things. That has been garbage forever. What we need to do is say, no, we are professionals. We are trained in how we understand our community, provide materials to our community in schools, have the idea of what is appropriate educational materials and reading levels. We have a voice here that is different from someone who's upset because they did a search for Jesus in their school library catalog and only found 2 books, but there are 4 on Muslims. That's accurate, right? We know what that means and why it happens and how, et cetera, et cetera. And so I love these 2 projects, or 3 projects. I just want to mention them because to me, for a long time with this discussion, I felt kind of impotent. I felt like I'm sitting on the side and what can I do? Right? And the answer was a couple of people stood up. So in Texas, the Texas Library Association launched their Texans for the Right to Read. It's an active advocacy campaign where they build up partnerships and they build up advocates and they actively create voices and counter disinformation about it. Every library, if you don't know every library, it's the country's only political action committee dedicated to librarianship. They teach things about how to pass bond issues, they fight for school libraries, they work on all these kinds of things. They're fabulous people, and this is the best idea. I hate this idea only because I didn't think of it. They launched the banned bookstore. So if you put in every library bans bookstore, they have created links where you can buy any of these books that were banned, and a percentage of that goes back to supporting every library. I love this idea. And the New York Public Library did one better. They created their Right to Read banned books. They created a digital work with publishers and a digital lending card that goes, no matter where you are in this country, you can read these banned books. I mean, I love this, right? This is a little in-your-face librarianship, and I'm okay with that. So, part 2. This sounds great. We're going to fight censorship. We buy it. We believe the whole thing. We're out to fix the world. Let's go, Dave. Let's go. So, in last fall, we had a symposium where we were talking about what is the future of libraries, yet again. And the last of these 4 sessions was to come up with our new normal agenda. What does a post-COVID agenda for librarianship looks like? And one, we don't know because there are many of them. But what was interesting is we didn't come up with one. And we didn't come up with one, and we were all sort of scratching our heads. And at the end, had fabulous librarians who stood up and said, I'm tired. I am tired. I am drawn out. I have been beaten around. I am isolated. I am terrified. I can't think about tomorrow. I just can't. And I think we're all in that position. We're thrilled to be back together after 3 years, but we're still, vaccination stickers. By the way, I have 4. Not stickers, but boost shot. I should get 4. Anyway, but the idea of how do we support ourselves, right? So we've seen these during the pandemic with frontline nurses and frontline medical workers. They're done. They're strung out. We have a lot of healing to do within ourselves. If we want to go out and fight banned books, if we want to go out and look like our communities and work with underrepresented communities and really support LGBTQ+, support BIPOC communities, support all of this, we need to be ready to do this. And right now, as a profession, we're not. And it's not for lack of trying, it's the fact that we have been doing this under extraordinary circumstances, and it's hard. So what became clear to me was this example. Virtue calls, right? This is the idea where I get up and I give you a speech about how we're going to save the world, right? I start after part 1. So why the hell aren't you? Blah, 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 blah. So Sari Feldman, who is a good friend of mine, and I love her, and a dedicated librarian, wrote an article called Librarians, America is Counting on You in Publishers Weekly. And to say that the reaction to this article was negative might be a bit of an understatement. Here's one person who, Kate McLean, who wrote on Book Riot. I'm not hiding from it, I'm furious. I'm stressed out to the point where I feel like I'm vibrating from anxiety. Several years ago, I wrote about how I hated the hero narrative surrounding library work because calling us heroes ignores the fact that we are just average humans who need way more from our profession than our leaders are willing to provide. And now I'm watching that narrative play out on a national level. Libraries are resilient, they say, ignoring the fact that it's not safe for patrons or staff to open the libraries yet, but no one seems to realize that empty words can't keep us all safe. I'm guessing we've all felt this when we talked about opening up and going back in or providing curbside service. We had that moment that said, I run the library. I don't provide the food. I don't provide vaccination. Why am I going to risk my life and my children and my spouses and the people I caretake? And then, as a manager, how can I ask people to do this if I'm not? If any of you have been part of the library sphere, did you feel a real difference? Right around 2021, there was a massive discussion about the disconnect between those in the higher administrative offices and those of us on the front line. That's always been a murmur, but it became an outright fight online. And it's true. But what's amazing about this piece that Sari wrote, if you read it, you'll read it and you'll go, okay. I mean, if this was written before the pandemic, you would have said, okay, let's go get them. And Lankus is going to come and do the Lankus cheerleader thing, and I get it. And what happened was, we're not ready. It's not you, it's all of us. Fabozzi wrote about vocational awe. That was the idea that somehow you feel like you're called, that you entered the priesthood as opposed to took a job as a librarian. And you're supposed to do everything, right? Well, we're going to do this today. Okay, and we're going to do this, and and it's the apple pie problem that public libraries and libraries of all sorts have, right? There's nothing. If you put library at the end of something, it's always an aw shucks moment, right? It's like we're going to deal with, rent price fixing. Oh, in libraries, okay, right? If you throw reading after, you throw children's whatever, it's like we can't do anything bad. But the problem is that there's a trap for us as service professions. In reference work, looking at Marie, back in the day, we coined the phrase greedy librarian problem. That was when your librarian got a reference question, they were going to answer that question. They may not know the answer now, but they're not giving it up until they know the goddamn answer to that question. I mean, it could have been things like, are you open on Sunday night? And the person next to them is doing the schedule, but they're not going to turn their head. They're going to go online to find the answer, right? We do this. There's a weight to empathy. That is, we do this out of a service orientation. We go above and beyond. We pride ourselves on providing service and being the good people. But there's a weight and a cost to empathy. And so I was very interested because I was looking at this, and as we begin to shift into a pandemic, post-pandemic, whatever we're calling this new phase, how do we do it realizing the cost that we've paid to this point and learning from it? And for me, it comes for actually ideas out of oncology and the field of medicine. And for those of you who may know my background, I have a lot of experience in oncology. And that is when you talk to an oncologist, they were asking these doctors, how do you go up and say, you have an incurable brain cancer? How do you go out to the parents of a 9-year-old and tell them that probably their child has 6 months to live, if that? How do you provide this horrible news? How do you fight and fight and fight and fight to save someone's life and they die? How do you recover from that? How do you get the energy up to do it again? And they were talking trauma nurses, same thing. How do you fight and fight for people's lives and they pass away, and how do you live for that? I remember talking to someone who ran a support line for parents with newborns with major medical issues. And they had what they call the dead baby call. That is when the parent calls and says, the doctor told me this is the diagnosis, what can I do? And the only answer you can say is, love that child for the next 2 days. Whenever anyone got that call, they got to go home. They said, go home. Be with someone that you love. We've all had an experience. I used to talk about that, the story that keeps librarians going, that we love, that story that is how we sort of saved the world. And it never started with, I cataloged this book beautifully. Right? It's always, this kid who I recommended a book came to see me the next day, and I couldn't shut him up for 3 hours as they retold the book to me. Right? It's that person I helped escape from an abusive situation. It's the person I found a job. We have all these very strong stories. And what they said is, as they studied, they looked and they said the oncologists, and they are not empathetic. Empathetic is to feel and take on the emotions of others. They said they are compassionate. To be compassionate is to understand and identify with the issue, but not necessarily own the emotion itself. Doctors know that not everyone's going to live, and they know that it is traumatic when they don't. And they feel bad, and they want to be as supportive and as helpful as they can, but at the end of the day, they also realize that if they're going to help the next patient, they can't stop. We need to talk about compassion within the library field. We need to talk about trauma within the library field, not just our communities in trauma, but internally how we deal with it. So we need to know ourselves. And it begins with the idea of how do we define ourselves. If what I'm saying is, all right, look like your community, and some communities are doing esports teams, and some communities are doing this, and some communities are doing that, but don't go too far, and don't be empathetic, I've just created a lovely plan for I have no idea what he said or what to do next. So we need to begin to define what we are. And for me, the definition of a library comes down to 3 parts. We have a mission. This is what we seek to accomplish. Our mission is to improve society through facilitating knowledge creation in our communities. That's a big fancy way of saying our job is to help our communities get smarter. Right? It's rationalism, it's research, and the richest understanding comes from the richest sources, so it's about diversity, it's about multiple voices, it's about cultural and humility and cultural competencies coming to what we do. But that's not enough, because you can read that mission, and I've had publishers say, that's my mission, and teacher could say, that's my mission. Google could say, that's my mission. And then add a few $signs, right? So it's not enough to say the mission, because lots of people are, and those are our natural allies, by the way. Those are the people we want to work with together. But it also means how we enact those. How do we make that mission reality? We do that providing access to books and materials, but also access to people, and two-way. I see lots of libraries, for example, starting podcasting systems and video studios and maker spaces where people can gain access to the individual. You can become the way that I connect to my community. Knowledge, training. It's not enough to say, oh, here's a computer. It's the idea of how do you use it? How do I understand it? What's its implication? How does it work? A welcoming and safe environment. Libraries should be safe spaces to explore dangerous ideas. How do we make that happen? So a lot of the discussion, for example, before the pandemic were things like, well, what about our public spaces? And what if the alt-right or what if racist groups want to use our public spaces? Don't we have to let them by law? And the answer is maybe. It comes down to how you define your policy. And part of it is by letting them in, you're not simply providing freedom of expression, you're creating an atmosphere where a certain part of your population will feel threatened. They will not feel safe. That goes against our values. And finally, motivation. How do we connect and help people learn and help people understand and explore their passions? But once again, that's not enough as well, because once again, that can fit money. So the last thing we pull in are our values. We believe in learning. We believe that what we're there to do may not simply entertainment, but the idea that it's fundamentally helping people discover themselves and something about themselves. We believe in openness. We believe in diversity. We believe in intellectual honesty, which is not the same as being objective and non-biased. When you provide people with multiple views on a topic, you are not saying all of those are equally good anymore, but you are saying I'm responding to your request. And we believe in intellectual freedom and safety. So once we can define ourselves, excuse me, I just threw things on the floor. That was useful too. One of these is, forget. Okay, so the other one is, we are relationships, not transactions. Back in teaching the reference day, right, this is where everyone declares their age. Teaching reference was you walk them through the book and you walk away. Because even if you open the book or you point to a chapter, you're biased how they're going to learn from it. Give it up. You are biased. When people walk up to your desk, when people come online, your color of your skin, your accent, y'alls, bow ties, all of this are influencing the environment. We need to be conscious of that. And once again, our goal is not to let society go to hell in a handbasket. Neutrally, it's to try and make our communities better. It's like, well, the community wants to ban books, that's fine, as opposed to, you should not ban books. Right? That's not a neutral stance. And so we need to be moving to this idea where libraries were about information. That's where I go to get information. Sounds very passive. And really to the idea of libraries as service. I go there to get services from circulation and reading to makerspaces to meeting rooms to what have you. We then move to the idea of libraries as platforms, where you can do almost anything with these resources. You can have your conference there, you can have your meeting, you can be taking academic courses, you can be working for your GED, you can simply be there for fun. The platform of services are yours to connect in your own way. And really we're beginning to embrace the concept of the library as a movement. That the library is an organizing force where librarians and community members are getting together to make something happen, to make something better. We want to be able to say that we're worth our budgets. But if we're going to say that, how do we tie it to what we've done about it? For example, in academic libraries, how much of your library was responsible for the grade that the student received? How much of the quality of life in a public environment have you provided? How much of academic success and belonging in a K-12 environment has happened? How do we prove that we are moving things forward? And if we say forward, then you have a definition of that, and you can't pretend that you're unbiased. So I'm going to stop there, because that's my time, but I'll just finally end it with, we have opportunities, and we are embracing our communities, which is good. And it's going to look very different across all of our services, which is good. And we're going to talk to each other and connect, which is great. And we need to make sure that we, as the primary instrument of the library's value, let me say that again, the library staff is the primary instrument of library value. It is not the collection, it is not the books, it is not the roof, it is not the lawn. It is you making all of that available in a way that matches the community needs that pushes them forward. How are we going to be prepared to do that? Coming out of an environment when we are isolated and we are cautious and we're worried about dying, how can we move forward and help our communities do so as well? We have immense challenges right now. Let us never underestimate them. And I'm not asking you to jump in as a virtue call. I'm asking us to be smart about it and acknowledge our limitations, prepare ourselves to innovate, and then, when we are able and when our communities are ready, seek to continually innovate and push forward. Thank you very much. We got time, too.